Okay, good afternoon. Let's get started. We've got a number of folks who are safer traveling, so our group is a bit smaller for today. But I did want to take some time in a shortened class period to go over some remaining things to know from this week. And as promised, we'll be spending the first part of the class doing a practice short essay question that represents the types of questions you should expect to see on the final exam. All right, so last class, we talked about family communication and preparation for the final exam. Again, this week, we're talking about family and friendship communication. Those things, as well as relationship communication, are good things to brush up on as you prepare for that final exam. For today, we're going to be working through this practice short essay question that connects to the ideas that we've been talking about so far. We'll also discuss some of the challenges and unique elements of family relationships, with a particular emphasis on sibling relationships and relationships in married couples. So we'll be looking at some of those dynamics in a bit more detail. As a reminder, for your exam, it's December 12th to 14th, structured just like the previous exam. You get 72 hours, that 3-day window to take it. Remotely, you get 2 hours to take it once you choose to open it. Again, those study questions and the study guide will help you as you're preparing for that. Again, if you go up to front page of Canvas, you'll see final exam practice questions that include these multiple choice, as well as 2 short essay questions that are in addition to the 2 practice short essay questions we'll be going over today. And again, the link to the final exam study guide is here as well. That just goes over the terms and concepts that you need to know as you prepare. And just to give you, again, a reminder about our remaining class meetings, we only have 3 left this next week after today. We have a Canvas prompt number 7, which is due on Sunday. So if you do not have the 6 yet, this is one of your last opportunities to do so. We'll be looking at interpersonal communication in the workplace next week, as well as negative elements of interpersonal communication. And then one update that I want to let you know about is that the 9th is our prep for the final exam. And just like last time, I'd like to make this an attendance optional class period where you're welcome to come in. If you have questions and want to participate in the review, we'll do another review game to help you prepare. But I also know a lot of people are doing travel and navigating all of that stuff right at the end. So if you prefer to take that time to yourself, you can do that. Just note that last Canvas prompt is due. And then the final exam, and then the extra credit and any remaining assignments are due on the 14th. Again, that's a hard deadline so that I can get the grades submitted and the extra credit. There'll be a recording available, but it can also involve, if you so choose, participating face-to-face in the event that we'll have with Oregon Rural Action next Wednesday afternoon. So what I'd like to do to get us started is this practice question for your attendance and participation for the day. So I'll walk through this question a little bit and give you some time to work on this. So again, this is a good example of the type of question you should expect to see on the final exam. This question relates to friendship and family communication, again, elements that we've been talking about over the course of this week. According to the reading and class discussion, in what ways are friendship and family communication similar and different? Explain using an example. Part 2 is to pick one concept in family communication and one concept in friendship communication. How do these concepts explain the ways that friends and family communicate? And then lastly, consider a theory of mediated communication. How does this theory contribute to our understanding of how friends and family members communicate? So you'll have between now and 12:24 to complete this practice question, and your time to do so starts now. We have 10 more minutes. Have 5 more minutes.
Communication. Would it be more computer?
So I would look at the ones like social presence series, and some of those that are more directly related. issues with PDF, they're a little less directly connected.
Oh.
Good question. Go ahead and wrap up your current thought or idea here. Okay. Like to do another finger poll. So 1 is very easy, 5 is very difficult, 3 is somewhere in between. How challenging did you find completing this practice question under this period of time? Okay. A lot of folks in the 2 to 3 range. Good. So I'm glad that it wasn't too challenging. Again, a lot of this information is pretty fresh in your head, and you'll have the benefit of having done the previous exam and set of questions here. So friendship and family communication, which is what we've been discussing this week, has a few different things we can explore. In what ways are friendship and family communication similar and different? While they're similar, and some examples here of good responses to this prompt would be a focus on developing relationships and creating meaningful relationships between different people through things such as self-disclosure, spending time with somebody, and so on. Right? We've talked a lot about this idea of creating those meaningful connections, and that oftentimes there's a pretty blurred line between friends and family. For instance, we might consider very close friends to be chosen family and put them in that type of circle. So that would be one way that we could see similarities there. I think one difference is to think about roles. So a lot of our family roles are defined from a very young age or developed in a very regular, kind of unconditional way. Whereas in a lot of friend roles, it usually starts with us having defined roles that are casual and not based on friends, and we make a very voluntary and agentic decision to develop a friendship, right? So the strategy of actively seeking somebody out and choosing to get to know them better might be a way that you can contrast the two and talk a little bit more about friendship communication. One concept in family communication, one concept in friendship communication. So there's a lot of different examples that you could use here. One that you could think about, one thing that's good to refresh on as you're preparing for the exam would be family systems theory. We talked about that on Wednesday, the idea of the ways that different parts of the family structure work together. So things like interdependence and so on might be used to understand how a family relationship is playing out. One concept that we might talk about in friendship communication might be the different stages of a friendship. For example, a move toward friendship, friendly relations, and then ways that friendships might break off over time. So that model of development of friendships could work. You might also think about some of the patterns of family communication, such as protective versus laissez-faire and so on, and use that to contrast those. And then theories of mediated communication, that goes back a little bit, but some of the theories we talked about have been social presence theory, media richness theory, social information processing theory, etc. For instance, you could use social information processing theory and this idea of hyperpersonal communication to discuss how perhaps you can form closer relationships with friends or family in a mediated context than face-to-face if you're really actively spending time catching up and talking with them. Right? So just some examples of possible ways to tackle these questions and contrast those things. Again, being asked to contrast some of these ideas is a good representation of what you might expect here for the exam. All right. So let's get into a few of the new things. And again, I don't think we'll take the whole class time working through these, but I do want to wrap up our discussion about family communication and some of the ways that we think about family communication. So there is a model of family and family relationships that's given by your book, but I think that it's important to recognize this is a very kind of linear and in many ways kind of traditional and somewhat outdated way of thinking about this structure, right? So as we're looking at this, I think that there's a lot that we can push back against, critique, or recognize. It's not always the model that's being used here. There are also, as the book brings up, a lot of cases of family and family development that follow outside of this structure too. For instance, there are many cases in which you have couples, right, who are families, but for various reasons do not choose to have children. Or you might have families in which something like a divorce or change in one's life and people in their family drastically recalibrates where they are, right? So this is not an end-all be-all, all families are like this or structured in this way, Rather, this helps us to contextualize how families have been studied in the past and some of the general patterns that tend to emerge in how family communication is studied, right? Generally speaking, at early stages of families, we look at a younger couple, a stage of getting to know, connecting, and forming a sense of shared values. This connects to a lot of our discussion about coming together in early stages of relationship development. Young couples who might not have children, right? And again, this is the stage that people might choose to remain in. Generally speaking, in a lot of family contexts, we have what's considered the full nest one stage, where you have a family that has very young children. One thing that's studied in family communication is the ways in which this stage is oftentimes marked by pretty significant shifts in somebody's life, well-being, and so on, right? At this very early age, children are oftentimes taking up a lot of time and energy. They're impacting things like work schedules, but they're also the source of a lot of joy and meaningful connection for many people. So people find that a lot of their life has been very upended and changed at this stage. Full nest 2 is considered to be a kind of return to some level of structure. Oftentimes family members might choose to return to work at that stage. At this stage, oftentimes you might fall back on some of the previous patterns that emerge. Older children moving from kind of a full to empty nest. I think again point to a lot of the examples here in demographic changes. You're probably familiar with the term empty nesters, or the way that this is used, kind of like a bird being pushed to leave the nest. A lot of times in family communication, we explore how in a transition from adolescence to adulthood, people might choose to physically leave, move out on their own. However, one change that has been really notable for the past several years in particular, due to a combination of economic hardship as well as COVID-19, is that we have a much higher degree of people who in college or after graduation are moving back in with family and choosing to spend more time with family, either by financial necessity, choosing to be a commuter student from a region, and so on, right? So this is not necessarily a linear, you are leaving a place at this time, and also could deeply connect to the roles, values, and beliefs within a culture or family as well. For instance, if somebody finds as a young adult or adolescent that they need to be in a caretaking role for a family member, it can also be a big source of change. As things move more in an empty nest direction, one pattern that's studied in a lot of family contexts is an idea of a midlife crisis, of experiencing a feeling of routine and bleakness that comes in having your life somewhat established, but not feeling the same degree of novelty or satisfaction, and trying to find sources of happiness and joy within that. So if you see like people in their mid-40s who suddenly decide to get new motorcycles, right? That's an example of this stage. An empty nest toward retirement generally is reflecting and looking back at later stages of life, thinking back to Erik Erikson's development model. This is a stage where we're oftentimes reflecting on our experiences. Sole survivor stage is one in which somebody, as part of a couple, right, might have a spouse or significant other who's passed away, no longer involved in their lives. So in that stage, people are oftentimes very reflective. They might search for opportunities for new connection and so on. Again, this is not a structure that's representative of all or many of the ways that families play out, but I think that this model is a useful way of understanding how family communication has been studied and patterns that tend to emerge at different stages of family development. So this idea here, how we understand and model what family is something that we can see as changing in a very dynamic way. When it comes to sibling relationships in particular, sibling relationships are one of the ones that are the most studied. I think they're one of the most unique and at times one of the most contentious types of relationships that we can look at. There's a good chance that many of you have your own siblings and have very strong feelings about them and about how you communicate with them. So there's been a lot of work done to try to understand, unpack, and develop a framework for healthy communication among siblings. So we have this model here that understands sibling relationships both in terms of hostility and warmth. As we talked about on Wednesday, a relationship can both be unhealthy but entertaining and satisfying, right? It can be high drama and very intense. And then in a similar way, sibling relationships can both be hostile as well as warm. They can have both of those things at once. They oftentimes move back and forth between those two things pretty strongly. So those two things are measured here. A hostile sibling relationship is one in which there's little warmth but a lot of disagreement. This oftentimes can happen if you and a sibling have really drifted apart and your relationships with that sibling have become very antagonistic. For example, siblings who might have some level of falling out with each other. This is also present in a lot of households in which siblings might have very limited interaction with each other, such as seeing each other on holidays or other periods of time in which the times that they do spend with each other, there's less of a social consequence of having a negative relationship with them. And we also know that this is especially a challenge when we consider stepchildren and step siblings involved. Not that there's not great relationships that happen there, but to say that sometimes the challenges of navigating a blended family can bring with it challenges with how siblings interact with each other. An affect-intense relationship is one that a lot of us might find relatable. It's a relationship in which there's both a lot of hostility and a lot of warmth. So that could be a brother, sister, sibling that you fight and argue with a lot of the time and you find really gets on your nerves, but also somebody that you love and really care for you. Both of those things can be true, and you oftentimes feel these extreme back and forth feelings between them, especially in earlier stages, right? As kids, where you're pulling pranks on each other, giving each other a hard time, but nevertheless, you care and love each other. Uninvolved is generally low hostility and or warmth. This is especially true in cases in which siblings do not live together. So maybe they were raised apart for various reasons, such as in a divorced or separated household. Maybe they are now adults and are not in active communication. So there's just not as much going on there. And then a harmonious sibling relationship has a high degree of warmth, low hostility. That's generally one where you feel really positive about your relationship with your sibling. Maybe you have a younger sibling with whom you see that positive relationship. That would be an example of harmonious relationships playing out too. So this reflects both the positive and challenging elements of sibling relationships, right? To give you one example of this, my family, I have an older sister. She's a half sister on my dad's side, and she's 17 years older than me. We spent a lot of our time apart growing up. My partner is the exact opposite. She is the oldest sister of six, and her siblings are only like each sibling is like 2 years apart from her, right? So she grew up with a lot of siblings relationships. As an older sister, I grew up, as a younger sibling with a less connected single sibling. So we've had a lot of differences in understanding sibling relationships and communication. One of them, of course, being age. Oftentimes, sibling relationships are unique because they're a peer. They're somebody that's a somewhat similar age to us, and so we might look to them as a role model, as guidance. We might recognize that we're helping provide them with some direction and support in their lives. So the ability to have less of an age gap with a sibling versus a parent is something that can make a sibling relationship unique. They can understand or get some of the things you're experiencing in a way that others don't. Adoption status, as mentioned, perhaps in a household where some siblings might be adopted, is another factor. Feelings of love and belonging become especially important in a lot of those contexts. A household, right? Who is in the household? What type of household is it? In terms of generation, in terms of people who actively live there, and so on. And number of siblings is another important consideration. Generally speaking, if there are a lot of siblings in a family, there might be a greater emphasis on competition, on trying to get attention and be noticed by other people in your family. So at times that can add to some of these relationships feeling a bit more on edge. When it comes to strategies, right? In sibling relationships, we do a lot of things in order to maintain and manage our relationships. One of them is confirmation. For instance, saying, I'm really glad to have you as a sister, providing some sort of verbal reinforcement or agreement, and really showing that you care about and have established the stakes of that relationship. Another is using humor, right? Oftentimes we like to have pranks or jokes. Humor is a pretty big source of relationship development in siblings, especially among siblings who have that from a fairly young age. Give you one example. When I was a kid, when I was pretty young, I loved Thomas the Tank Engine and trains. A lot of people my age did. And we were out shopping one time, and I did not want to go home. And so what my sister told me was that she was going to drive me somewhere with train tracks. And I was so excited because I was train tracks. And I love train tracks. And then I gradually got incredibly upset when I realized that she was just driving me home, and that she told me she was taking me somewhere with train tracks, all just to get me to leave and go home. And I was really upset about the time, but my sister and I laugh about it later, and it's like one of our inside jokes. We use a lot of humor as a way of providing support among siblings, sharing experiences with each other, and so on. We also have a joke about how there's chickens and roosters like everywhere I go. Oftentimes, like I'm driving on the road or something, and there's chickens on the side of the road, or I'm out on a hike and I'm trying to trudge through a river and there's a chicken on a rock that's almost mocking me there. So we have some inside jokes. Social support is managing our social needs. Again, one thing that siblings bring is a lot of focus on our social and belonging needs that we don't see otherwise. There's a good chance that maybe for some advice, like relationship advice, fashion advice, and so on, you maybe felt more confident talking about that with a sibling than with a parent. You felt like they were closer and more in on some of those needs and belonging that you have. Visits, including how frequently and often you contact and discuss issues with your sibling, are another consideration, right? So we use those to connect. We also use siblings oftentimes to escape. Maybe we feel frustrated with other members of the family, and we have a sibling with whom we're very close that we're really able to have the chance to share with. And aggression, right? We argue, we might have some unique challenges or issues that come up in sibling relationships. So verbal aggression is another issue that can happen. All of these help us to explain the strategies that we use to manage sibling relationships in particular. Sibling relationships are a challenge for a lot of reasons. One is a perception of scarcity and limited resources. If you think about a lot of animal species, like you think about a dog that gives birth to a litter of puppies, well, the puppies are like kind of stepping over each other and like fighting over each other to get milk, right? And sometimes there's almost a similar mindset of whether it's material resources, but more likely the social needs and resources. We feel some degree of competition with our siblings in terms of receiving attention from family. Sometimes that perception and competition can add complications to sibling relationships. Creating and establishing identity, right? Oftentimes we're looking to siblings as examples of who we want to be or who we don't want to be, and define ourselves in terms of our sibling relationships. In fact, in a lot of studies related to identical twins, one challenge that comes up are identical twins wanting to be their own people and feel distinct from each other despite sharing a lot in common. And then perceived differences in life experiences. That is, especially when we consider factors such as age. In those gaps, people might grow up in different backgrounds. For instance, sometimes a source of tension is an older sibling who feels like they were the guinea pig or test subject from their family compared to a younger sibling. Or sometimes younger siblings feel like they didn't get the same attention or care that an older sibling. So sometimes these differences can be a source of friction too. When it comes to marriage relationships, right? We can think about this both in terms of marriage, but also in terms of like a domestic partnership or some other type of contractual or written agreement between couples. These generally have a variety of different dimensions. For instance, how conventional versus non-conventional that arrangement is. how much it adheres to perhaps the cultural roles, tropes, stereotypes, and so on of that relationship. Another factor here is ideology, the mental frameworks or ways that people might approach something like marriage. One example being is if somebody wants a very large wedding or another couple just wants to elope. Sometimes marriage is seen out of love. Sometimes marriage is seen in more of a practical and transactional approach in the context of things such as arranged marriages. There's also a focus on interdependence and connectedness, feeling close, but also wanting to be autonomous. And again, that dialectic is at play there. And then the differences in how people might choose to approach conflict. So when it comes to these categories and the ways that these play out, they generally play out either as a traditionalist, independent, or separate. Traditionalist is one that very closely follows a lot of defined categories, families, and rules. Oftentimes follows a lot of the scripts, is very close and really focuses on meaningful connection, cohabitation, and so on. These types of marriage relationships are more likely to follow a lot of the social and cultural scripts, right? Again, one example of thinking about marriage relationships and traditionalist versus separates, right? As a traditionalist views marriage more like this versus a separate who views it more like this. An independent is somewhere in between in that there's a focus on autonomy in relationships, being your own person, but still having the opportunity to connect and be close, right? One way of thinking about this is like a Venn diagram, where there is a combination of things that both like to do, but also activities that are independent. We also know from the past several years, there's a rise in a lot of distance relationships, particularly in a professional setting, right? Where people are living in different places. And then separates are generally very independent. They do their own thing a lot of the time. There's low levels of contact or intimacy or connection for various reasons. Maybe a relationship has drifted away, or maybe the cultural expectations of that relationship are just that those marriage and family relationships are not as close. What I want to add here about conflict in relationships is that, as mentioned, lack of conflict is not necessarily an indicator that a relationship is healthy, right? That in a lot of marriage situations, that conflict avoidance can sometimes mean that there are issues or topics that don't come up and that aren't comfortable to be addressed by both parties, and can sometimes create for more destructive exchanges later. So navigating the role of conflict and to what degree people in marriage or family context choose to engage in conflict, I think is another important element for us to look at as well. So these types of relationships help to frame the ways that we understand different approaches to communication, connection, culture, and so on. So that covers the remaining things from this week. Again, focusing specifically on family, sibling, and marriage relationships, the ways that these oftentimes bring about some unique tensions and challenges of conveying hostility, warmth, and figuring out how to relate to family. Again, family relationships are oftentimes the most challenging, but also among our most rewarding and meaningful. So remember that this Canvas prompt number 7 is due on Sunday, related to the concept from this week's readings. Next week is our final week of the term. We'll talk about interpersonal communication in the workplace on Monday. If you haven't done so already, please email or pass forward your practice question. I'm not going to be formally grading it, but if you would like feedback on it and let me know and you'd like to know what grade you should expect to receive on that, send me an email and I'm happy to get that to you. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you on Monday.